Welcome to the first broadcast of One Stop News. I'm Michael Rummel, and I'll be doing shows every Wednesday and Sunday to bring you a summary of what's going on in the world. In the U.S., Trump continues to dominate headlines into the third week of his presidency. The biggest headline of the week was definitely his immigration ban, and has targeted Iraq, Syria, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. A Muslim ban was a significant part of his campaign, so it's not a terribly big surprise that he carried it out. What is interesting, though, is what countries weren't included, namely Saudi Arabia or any of the other Gulf states, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. All of these states have varying levels of terrorist activity, and members of the Saudi royal family in particular have been accused of funding terrorist groups, ISIS included. The ban, however, was first halted by Judge Ann Vonley of New York, and later in full by Judge Robart in Washington. They both cited it as unconstitutional. The Trump administration, however, has sent an appeal, which was to immediately reinstate it. However, that was denied, and now the court is hearing arguments. This does not mean it's dead, and this court battle could prove blankly depending on how far they're willing to go. There are a few factors in this that will play in. The first is that since it's a temporary ban, Trump's lawyers have made the argument that it doesn't matter what the reason is because he can make a temporary ban on anything. However, others have cited it as unconstitutional because they are saying he is targeting Muslims because of it. Now, their defense against this will likely be that it targets countries, not Muslims in particular, which is legal, as there is historical precedent of this. There's the Chinese Exclusion Act, country quotas back in history. No recent precedent, of course, but it has legal precedent and that it is legal to do. So it will be interesting to see how the court rules. President Trump has not been confined to just the immigration ban. He's also promised to end current political limits on churches, which will allow preachers and churches to publicly endorse candidates as well as donate to their campaigns. This rule is already rarely enforced, but there is the idea behind it that it is a separation of church and state. And Trump may not follow through with this promise, but he has made it nonetheless. He has also taken the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, and acting director of National Intelligence, Mike Dempsey, from principal seats on the National Security Council. This removal was on the basis that they would only be needed when their areas of expertise were involved. The Trump administration did appear to clear it up later on, saying the two will always have an invite to the meetings. Regardless, it is unlikely that the Pentagon and many of the intelligence services are particularly happy about this move. On a different issue of national security, Trump has put Iran, quote, on notice after a recent ballistic missile tests. While being put on notice doesn't actually mean anything, he did put sanctions on several individuals who are connected to the Iranian missile program. The missile they tested is a medium-range one that has the potential to carry nuclear warheads. However, it does appear that it was not in violation of the nuclear accords. It may have violated a different UN treaty, but I couldn't find any source that said for sure. And if it did, it likely violated it in spirit rather than in actual practice. Iran responded to these sanctions by imposing legal restrictions on a group of Americans they say, quote, were involved in helping and funding regional terrorist groups. There was also a raid this weekend targeting the head of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Qasim al-Rimi. Unfortunately, he escaped this raid and was seen later in reportings talking about how he escaped and insulting Trump. One Navy SEAL did die in the raid, though, along with 14 al-Qaeda fighters and several civilians, the youngest of whom was an 8-year-old girl. I do apologize for jumping around so much. There's just been a lot of news coming out of the White House. Trump has also nominated a Supreme Court Judge, Neil Gorsuch, who has been called, quote, Scalia-esque. I will have a more in-depth look on Gorsuch Sunday. The nomination of Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education has gone through, with Mike Pence casting the tie-breaking vote yesterday. It is the first time in history a vice president has used his vote to confirm a cabinet secretary. Trump's direct diplomacy with foreign leaders this week has certainly been interesting as well. In a call with President Nieto of Mexico, the Associated Press reported that he said something along the lines of, if you can't handle your problems, we'll send our troops in. That isn't a word for it, And from my reading of it, it seems like he said it jokingly, although I'm not Trump. And both governments have officially denied this was said. Trump also abruptly ended a call with Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull after calling the refugee deal made under the Obama administration a, quote, bad deal. He would later take to Twitter to say that he was, quote, looking into the deal. The deal itself is essentially a refugee swap. The U.S. would take roughly 1,250 refugees held in the Australian detention centers of Nauru and Manus Island, while Australia would take in asylum seekers in U.S.-backed detention facilities in Costa Rica. It also appears that the Army Corps of Engineers is set to greenlight the Dakota Access Pipeline, a development halted by Obama. This could see renewed protests from environmentalists and Native American tribes. And the last bit of news from the U.S. today. California police have arrested 474 people in a human trafficking sting in a statewide operation. Dozens were rescued, including 28 children. Now to the international stage. In Canada, a man killed 6 in a mosque shooting in Quebec. Reports have come out that he was known for far-right views and he was a known radical in the community. In Germany, Angela Merkel has gained a key ally in her bid to remain prime minister. The Christian Social Union, which has been critical of her immigration policies, has made the decision to endorse her for prime minister. There was worry they wouldn't, but it appears the disagreements between the two parties on immigration weren't severe enough to break the ties. The Christian Social Union is the Bavarian counterpart to Angela Merkel's Christian Democrats and their natural allies. In Romania, significant protests broke out last week as thousands are calling for the resignation of the government. 2 opposition parties in the Romanian parliament have also filed for a vote of no confidence, which is due today. Overall, the protesters are angry about corruption in the government, but what brought them into the streets was a bill that had been put forth in Parliament. This bill would have essentially decriminalized corruption for government officials as long as the amount was under $48,500. The ruling coalition did withdraw the motion after the protests started, but they still continue, as now they're just focused on corruption at large in the government. In France, presidential candidate François Fillon continues to fight back against claims that he embezzled funds by giving his wife a, quote, cushy assistant job in his office. He has called these allegations sexist and said that she is a valuable member of his team. These allegations, whether true or not, continue to dampen the prospect of Fillon's run, and he's no longer the frontrunner in the election. It now appears clear that Marine Le Pen, a Trump-like figure, is turning out to be the leader of the right in France this election. She, however, is also under investigation as she is alleged to have misused European Union funds. All of this is good news for Emmanuel Macron, though, a young centrist who is now the frontrunner for the French election. In stark contrast to Le Pen, he promotes the European Union and supports free trade and lower trade barriers. He has never ran for an election before, but he has served as the economy minister under François Hollande, so he's not totally without government experience. In Britain, Theresa May's visit to the United States has generated mixed opinions. Some are unhappy that she took the trip in the first place, while others understand the need for fostering ties with the U.S., particularly with Britain's exit from the EU imminent. The European Union itself has pledged to offer $200 million to the Libyan government in an attempt to limit the amount of refugees leaving the Libyan coast. It is unclear how effective this measure would be, though, as the Libyan government is still on incredibly shaky ground and may not be able to use the money effectively. In Russia, opposition journalist Vladimir Karamazov Jr. remains in critical condition after a, quote, severe poisoning by an unknown substance that caused him to go into critical organ failure. He has been a harsh critic of the Putin administration and was poisoned in 2015 as well. The Israeli Knesset has approved a bill that would legalize 4,000 settler homes in the West Bank. This comes after an announcement to build 6,000 new homes in the West Bank. Israel has faced harsh international criticism for these settlements, but they are going forward with them nonetheless. In Syria, government forces have surrounded the ISIS stronghold of al-Bab, cutting off all the supply lines. Turkish-backed rebels are approaching from the north as well, and if the assault is successful, they will have taken over ISIS's largest base in the Aleppo province. The U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces are currently in the process of surrounding the ISIS capital of Raqqa in Syria. The assault on this city began in November of last year and has been conducted in phases to gather control of the surrounding areas before the assault on the city itself. Currently, the main focus of the fighting is to the north of the city, with SDF forces supported by coalition airstrikes as well as U.S. and French special forces. A new meeting has also started in the capital of Kazakhstan, Astana, as representatives from Turkey, Russia, and Iran are discussing the technical parts of the ceasefire deal negotiated between Turkish-backed rebels, Shia militias, and government forces last week. Also out of Syria is the news released by Amnesty International stating that somewhere between 6,000 and 13,000 members of the civilian opposition have been hanged in the Syrian Saydnaya prison, also known as the slaughterhouse. In Turkey, roughly 820 people have been detained in a massive anti-ISIS operation. Most that were detained were foreign nationals. Civilian casualties in Afghanistan hit a record high of 16,000 in 2016, with a third of them being children. This comes after an escalation in fighting between Afghan security forces and armed insurgent groups. The trend does not look like it's going to stop soon, and yesterday at least 20 were killed in a suicide bombing at the Afghani Supreme Court. Another 45 were wounded, but these are conservative numbers and they are expected to rise. In Gambia, Adama Barrow is fully in charge of Africa's newest democracy after Yahya Jammeh departed the country last week, ending a 22-year rule. There was worry of bloodshed when Jammeh refused to stand down after the election, but he fled the country after it became clear that he had no support. The President of Nigeria, Muhammadu Buhari, has asked Parliament to extend his medical leave in London indefinitely, as concerns grow over the health of the 74-year-old. Under Buhari, several anti-fraud agencies have arrested several prominent politicians accused of corruption, maintaining a campaign promise he made in this 2004 election. During his tenure, the military has also gained a lot of ground on Boko Haram, taking a significant amount of territory. The group still remains a significant threat, though. In South Africa, 200,000 Zimbabweans face deportation as the government has yet to renew their permits to remain in the country. In the Congo, talks have resumed to institute a transitional government after the death of iconic opposition leader Etienne Tshisekedi, after his death threatened to derail the entire process. Opposition groups, however, have rallied on despite his death in an attempt to bring democracy to the Congo. If this deal goes through, Joseph Kabila will remain as president during the year of transition government, while fresh elections will be held after the year. Kabila, who is 45 now, has ruled since his father's assassination in 2001. He has made billions as the president of Congo, with some estimates ranging at 15 billion or higher. In Cameroon, the blackout for the Anglophone region continues. This comes after significant protests against the government were met with violence and repression. More to follow on this on Sunday. In Australia, 1,265 Catholic priests, brothers, and nuns have been accused of child sex abuse. There have been over 4,400 allegations against these people, and the accused account for nearly 7% of Australia's clergy. In Indonesia, a court hearing has begun. It is looking into a billion-dollar fraud case brought against Goldman Sachs by local tycoon Beni Tadjikro-Saputra. Goldman Sachs has countersued for the same amount, claiming reputational damage. This comes in the wake of a bigger fraud case levied against Goldman Sachs in New York. The last bit of news for today is that Chinese billionaire Zhao Junhao remains missing following his disappearance a few weeks ago. Statements on his website that he was safe were removed, and rumors are swirling that he was abducted by the Chinese government, either in an anti-corruption purge or that he was opposed to President Xi. I know I haven't covered any Latin American stories on this Wednesday, but I will cover some Sunday, so I do apologize about that, but I am under time constraints as I don't want to make any videos too long. But I would just like to say thank you to everyone who did watch, and I hope you'll continue to do so. If there are any stories I didn't cover that you consider important, please drop them in the comments and I'll take a look and see if I can include them in the next episode. So I'll see you then.